The next requirement says you have to understand how to purchase Azure products and services. Now, in terms of signing up for a subscription, there are, I would say, almost 10 different types of subscriptions you can get. The one that I use for my courses that you might see sometimes are pay-as-you-go subscription. This is a credit card, and every month, at the end of the month, this charge goes against my credit card. I have to manage that. I can obviously put limits and things like that into it, but basically pay-as-you-go is the retail price. Like this is the posted price, and that's what you pay. You can also set up with an enterprise agreement. Now, this is an agreement that you negotiate with Microsoft. If you're a big enough company, you can basically sit down and say, well, we're going to need these types of services, and you can put them all together in a package, and Microsoft will say, okay, you're going to spend $150,000 a year. There's a minimum spending, so you can't just turn off all your services and expect the bill to come to zero. It's usually done on an annual basis, and the pricing that you pay may not exactly reflect the posted prices. And so if you've got specific needs, let's say you're in the need for lots of storage, like this is a massive amount of your company, a massive amount of your cost, Microsoft might be able to cut you a special break on storage pricing, but then you pay different prices for VMs and things like that. Okay, so this is the enterprise agreement. You're going to have to deal with Microsoft on that. Finally, there are certified cloud solution providers called CSPs that you might be working with a big provider. So maybe you're not working directly with Microsoft, but you're working with HP. And HP is doing a custom consulting solution for you, and it's $1 million project, and they're including services, support, application coding, architecture, and Azure services all included, and they can wrap that up into a particular plan, and that's different than an enterprise agreement with Microsoft. It's important to know and great for learning purposes that everyone can sign up for an Azure free account. I believe almost everyone. There's probably some countries of the world that you can't, but most countries of the world you can sign up for a free account. There's the URL. You just go azure.microsoft.com/free, and you'll be given an offer. And typically the offer is going to be unique to your country, but it's the equivalent of around $200 in credits that you can use Azure services up to that amount in the first 30 days. So it's very time limited. It's not forever. You got 30 days to just sort of spin up some bigger VMs or to use Azure storage or to do this up to that $200. And at that point, those services will be shut down automatically unless you sign up for a paid plan. Beyond the 30 days credit, you also get 12 months of certain free services. Now, there are a couple of VMs in there, so you can get a Windows VM and a Linux VM. There's some storage in there, some bandwidth in there. Other services available inside these 12 months free. So within the first year of having a free account, you're still going to be able to run some VMs and do some experiments, development, etc. Probably not good if you're trying to use this as a production environment because the free services are really the smallest ones, like B1MS size instances, but definitely good for development and playing around. Now you are limited to a single account, a single free account. So when that year runs up, you can't just sign up for another one. You'd have to have a separate credit card, etc. Also, there's just some services within Azure that are always free. So you're always going to be able to create, actually I have a list, I think. You're always going to be able to create like up to 50 virtual networks and certain services within there. There's a free web app. You can have up to 10 web apps that are the free tier, etc. Next thing you need to do is understand what are the factors affecting your bill. So when you get your bill every month, you don't want to have too much surprise. The thing with cloud computing is the bills are generally variable, but within a range, you would expect it not to exceed a certain amount. Different services are billed based on different factors. And so when you're doing your architectural design, if the cost of application is a factor, then the services that you choose to build into your design, you need to understand how that affects the cost. So like I said, in the last section, there are free services, and we can see that you can create like resource groups, up to 50 virtual networks. There's a basic load balancer that's free. You can set up a basic Azure Active Directory account for free. The security groups, there's free tier web apps. There's more than just these, but example of things that have no effect on costs, okay? So just dividing your network into 3 subnets, 4 subnets, 5 subnets, it's not going to materially affect your cost, for instance. But you do need to understand with cloud computing, like one of the great things about the benefits of cloud computing is the amount of savings that you can get. So instead of having to come up with $50,000 to purchase hardware up front, you end up paying so many $100 a month to rent those services, but it's metered. Okay, this is a standard electricity meter outside many people's houses, but Microsoft Azure and other cloud providers have their own concept of meters, and they're going to meter you on different things. I like to separate these out into what I call pay per usage or consumption model and pay for time. So this is where the opportunity for cost savings really does come in. If you use Azure Functions as an example, Azure Functions has a 1 million executions per month free. So if you have an application that runs every 5 minutes, for instance, just one execution every 5 minutes, that could run for free, because every 5 minutes, 20 times an hour, 48 times a day, that's well less than 1 million executions per month. If you need more than 1 million, you're going to pay only 20 cents for an extra 1 million executions. Again, these functions then are going to be running several times per second, right? Hundreds of times per second in order to get into this paid level. But as an example, to compare that to a virtual machine, if you just needed a virtual machine, which is a shared model where you've got other clients, other tenants on that physical machine, you're still paying at least $20 per month, probably up to $100 a month for a production level machine. Compare that to free 1 million executions and 20 cents for every other million, then you could really save a lot of money if you designed your applications differently. So we talked about functions. Logic apps are similar. With storage, you're paying per gigabyte. There are bandwidth charges for outbound bandwidth, which we'll talk about in a future slide here, and any kind of API calls. So if Microsoft provides, these text-to-speech APIs, you're going to pay depending on the number of times you call it. So that's a consumption model, and that's where you're going to get a lot of cost savings. You're not paying for stuff you're not using. The other model is sort of a pay for time model, and sometimes that's billed per second. So if you're just going to use a virtual machine or a CPU, then Microsoft meters that, and you're going to be paid for the time. Now with virtual machines with per second billing, that literally means the billing starts and stops to the second, and you're only charged for those seconds, okay? And as soon as you stop the virtual machine, your billing stops. Now, I put an asterisk at the end of that sentence because there are other things relating to your virtual machine that don't stop. So you're going to have storage accounts that are, to store the virtual hard disks. You might have IP addresses. You might have, other things supporting those virtual machines. You might still get billed for that. But the CPU usage, the compute power is charged by the second. So, when you're an architect working within a cloud environment or you're a business, there are different people out there. Some people really want stability in their pricing, right? They want to budget for, $10,000 a month for IT. They never want it to go over and they never want it to go under. Right? These are some, traditional accounting methods. And so you can just fire up your virtual machines. You can pay for managed storage, and you can affect yourself such that you can predict your bill fairly accurately because it's just paid fixed price per month, okay, whether you use it or not. There are ways of saving. So there's a thing called a reserved instance. So if you know that you're going to use this virtual machine for a minimum of 12 months, you might just want to pay for that in advance. And then you can see, significant savings, 20, 30, 40% savings on a 1-year commitment. If you're willing to go to a 3-year commitment for these virtual machines, you can see even 50% savings. Combine that with the licensing, the hybrid instances in terms of licensing, then you could save up to 70% based on reserved instances with hybrid licensing, etc. You also have these options of, your VMs can be multi-tenant, which means that you and other customers running on top of that virtual environment. Or you can even, in a web app, for instance, request isolated environment. And so you've got your own network, you've got your own physical machines guaranteed to be isolated from other customers, but there's a significant cost for that too. You're going to pay $1,000 a month for a web app isolated server, right? But that might be your requirements. So those options are all going to affect your pricing. Should mention, it's hardly ever mentioned when we're talking about pricing, but you do pay for bandwidth within cloud environments. So first 5 gigabytes is free in terms of outbound bandwidth. So if you do have a server that serves up web pages, you can serve up quite a few web pages. If your web page is, 200 kilobytes in HTMLs or whatever, you can serve up quite a few of those to get to the 5 gigabyte limit. Anything inbound coming into the Azure environment is free, so you only pay for outbound. We can look at some sample pricing. So Microsoft divides the world into zones. Zone 1 is all of the North American and some of the EU areas, excluding Germany. There's a DE Zone 1, which is the Germany, and the pricing is slightly different. So for outbound data, we're looking at 5 cents up to 8.7 cents per gigabyte, depending, they give you discounts the more that you use. So after the 5 gigabytes, your 6th gigabyte is going to be 8.7 cents and so on. Again, Germany up to 10 cents. Some of the Zone 2 countries are in Asia, Korea, and Japan, Africa, and in Australia. So that's a little bit more expensive. Those countries, the data prices are not as cheap as North America. And finally, Zone 3 is right now Brazil South, which is even the most expensive in terms of getting data out. But if you need servers in Brazil zone, then you must realize you pay a little bit more for the traffic. Now, if you take advantage of Microsoft has availability zones so that you're placing servers in very specific data centers and you have that requirement for availability, then there's going to be a little bit of an extra charge for pricing in terms of availability zones. Now, I do see this from time to time. There will be a student who says in the Facebook group, they have so many 1,000 terabytes of data into Microsoft Azure, and they're deciding to move to a different environment. Let's say they're moving to AWS, and they need to get the data out of Azure. And the realization hits them that if they have this data inside of Azure, there's no cheap and expensive way of getting data out. And so that's sort of the implication or the result of this outbound bandwidth thing is if you've stored up all this data into a data lake and you want to transfer it somewhere, you're going to have to pay for it. That's something to plan for, I guess. Now, at that level, for 1 petabyte of data, you're probably paying $25,000 a month for storage. So at that level, you probably already have the budget for it. And so maybe it's a surprise, but it's not necessarily break the bank for you. We talked about the zones. It's just a geographical grouping of different regions. Zone 1, the North American zone, which is United States, Canada, and Europe, UK, France. Zone 2 are Asia, India, Korea, Japan, etc. Zone 3 is Brazil. And Zone 4, DE Zone 1 is Germany. Okay, so we covered that previously. Now, to estimate pricing, Microsoft provides a pricing calculator. The URL is azure.microsoft.com, your country, and then pricing calculator. You can also probably find this at the top of the webpage along the azure.microsoft.com website. Now, realize that it's very hard to make exactly perfect estimates. Okay, so when you go into a pricing calculator, it's much like a shopping cart. You're going to be adding in. You're going to sort of estimate what your solution looks like, how many virtual machines you use, how much storage you use, how much bandwidth you use, other services that you require. You add them all into your shopping cart, you set the settings, and out pops an estimate of how much you're going to pay. You really have to have all that information up front to really understand what is required. So when you go into the pricing calculator, you'll be asked about which region of the world you want to put your servers in or your web apps, the pricing tier for some of these things, the instance type for instances, or the tier for web apps, what type of subscription you have. Like I said, if you've got your pay-as-you-go versus some type of enterprise plan, whether you require support. We haven't talked about the support options yet, but that's coming up. And you'll even pay less for dev servers. So if you have a SQL server, but it's not a production server, there's different licensing for that. And so those will be some of those options that you have to configure. Now, the great thing about these estimates are you can save them and then you can export them and share them. So it might take you some time to come up with a really good estimate, not done all in one sitting. Once you got it, then you might want to export that as a CSV file and share that around to different people to say, hey, this is what the savings look like when we move to Azure. Microsoft has been talking about the total cost of ownership, or TCO, for years and years and years. And this is even going back to just a typical Windows server. The concept of the total cost of ownership is that when you're comparing two solutions, like a self-hosted solution versus a cloud solution, it's not entirely fair to just compare the upfront cost of the server to the cloud price, right? So let's say you need to go to Dell.com, purchase a rack server, and Dell is going to charge you $1,200. And you go into the Azure portal and you see that that's priced at $120 a month. And you say, wow, that's only 10 months to get your money back. Might as well purchase the server ourselves. That's not really a fair comparison. So the cost of a server is more than just the cost of the hardware. There are other costs. So when you're hooking up your own server to your own rack, you're going to pay for the electricity. So how much per month does that server add to your electricity bill? That room needs to have air conditioning or cooling. You need to have internet connectivity to that site. And so whatever percentage of that cost, there is a physical storage for that. So a server sits in a secure room with a locked door, and you have perhaps a physical rack, and those servers have to live there. There are people that are required not only to take your machine, set it up for you, install Windows, back up the image, etc. There's ongoing maintenance of that server, applying patches and things that need to happen to that server over time. And even just the whole, backing up and where you store those backups, and if you're, storing them to tape or offsite and all that stuff. So all of those costs get factored into the cost of a server. Microsoft has a pricing calculator specifically for this. Azure.microsoft.com/pricing TCO calculator. So, or look for that in the menu as well. And then you'll be able to calculate the true cost of owning a server, and that might be a more fair comparison to compare it to cloud. So let's say you're in that process, you're starting up your application, you've done your estimate, you've done your programming, you've got everything running. One of those challenges of cloud computing is you want to ensure that you minimize your Azure costs over time, that you don't just let it sit there and grow month after month, year after year, 5 years down the road, realizing that you are spending way too much on computing that you weren't planning to. And I've been in environments where people are suddenly realize that they're spending $100,000 a month, and they want to see if they can cut that down. So there are many different best practices. First thing I'll recommend is that there's this tool called Azure Advisor that is available to everyone, and it has a cost tab. And in the Azure Advisor cost tab, it makes some recommendations for identifying resources that aren't being used. So if you have express route connection that isn't being utilized, or virtual machines that haven't been touched, etc. So they're going to make recommendations to you in an automated way of how you can save money within Azure, right within the Azure portal. I absolutely recommend people implement the auto shutdown feature for dev and QA resources. I do this myself where, people can work late, so 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock might not be too unusual in your environment, but, after midnight, should those resources still be running. And so if you shut down resources, dev and QA resources from midnight to 8 a.m., that's a 33% savings in terms of the time, right? You're billed only for the time the resources are up and running and executing. So being able to shut down those resources between midnight and 8 a.m. is a 33% savings right there. So that's worth a project to go through and ensure resources are not running when people aren't using them. Within storage accounts, there's the concept of hot, cool, and archive storage. That's a relatively new feature, but you should try to utilize that. If you do have files that are backups and zips and storage that are not often accessed, by getting that into cool or archive containers, you are actually implementing savings. Like the archive savings is 90% storage costs off of the hot tier. So you can get some significant savings for storage that you're not really using, that you need for governance reasons. You need to store the files for emergency reasons, but you don't actually need active daily access to it. Mentioned before about using reserved instances, you can save 20, 40, 50% if you reserve your VMs 1 year or 3 years at a time, which is a commitment that you're making to use those VMs for that period. If you implement hybrid licensing as well, you can get that saving up to 70%. So if you're going to end up with 50 or 100 virtual machines, no sense paying by the second for all of them if you know that for 50 of them, you're never going to get less than 50. You might as well sign the contract and, reserve them in advance. It's also smart to have alerts. And so you can, with cost management within Azure, you can set up reports that get automatically generated. You can have a daily or a weekly report come to you, or you can set up an alert when you know that you're expecting $1,000 to be charged, and then it hits that $1,000 on the 20th of the month. Then you can say, wait a second, we are exceeding the expectation here. So setting up alerts is one way to detect you've got an out of control process, you've got a VM that was started and never stopped, etc. Setting up Azure policy can actually prevent some of these issues. Like Azure policy will say, we don't allow virtual machines with more than 16 CPUs, and you can just, restrict access to those higher level servers that are really going to run up the cost really fast. Or you can say for developers, anyone who's in the developer group only has access to these virtual machines, etc. You can restrict it by resource group, restrict it by the whole subscription. So using policies to restrict resource costs is one way to save money as well. One of the great benefits of cloud computing is the concept of auto-scaling, and that's that a resource can grow based on demand and can then shrink based on demand. And so if you have an application that gets really busy in the springtime, so let's say in the month of April, you get 10 times, 20 times the traffic that you get the rest of the year, then you can have those applications that grow in April and shrink back down, and then during the rest of the year, they're still functioning and available, but they're running at a much smaller set of resources. And so instead of reserving the maximum and then keeping them idle, you want to have things shrink as required. Now, sometimes you over-provision resources. You go and create a managed storage account that has, hundreds of terabytes, and then you find yourself only using 15 terabytes. And so you can then make a little project to copy those resources into a properly sized managed account, and that will save you money. Same thing with virtual machines. If you're running on a too big a server, too powerful a server, you can obviously downsize that to save money on that. One tip for you is to, when you're looking at your resources, you might want to make sure everything is properly tagged, because one of the challenges within a big corporate environment is when there's a server running or there's a folder or a storage account, whose is it? You've got this server that's costing you $250 a month, and not every person knows what every resource is for, and then you have to ask around. So why not set a policy that says every resource must have billing tags or ownership tags or an email address associated with it, and then you have a person you can go to and say, hey, this server's been running, costing us $250 a month. Are you still using it? Right? So you can just use the tagging mechanism or keep it in a spreadsheet, if you will, so that every resource has an identifiable owner, and that makes your management of costs a lot cleaner. You could even send reports. I remember even going back 10, 15 years, a company would give us a cell phone, a mobile phone, and then they would put bills on our desks at the end of the month so we can review our mobile phone usage and approve it. So I can imagine in the world of the cloud that you can basically set up reporting so that every person who owns resources gets a report every month, and they need to sign their signature on the bottom line to approve those bills. And if something's not that they don't understand where it came from, that can be investigated. There are some other free tools besides those. One is called Azure Cost Management that is now enabled for a lot of people. It's a free tool within Azure that allows you to analyze historical spending. So you can look back over time and you can see what you're spending money on. You can set budgets. You can have reports. You can have reports that are sent to you automatically, etc. Analyze spending over time, tracking against budgets for things, schedule and automatically send reports.